Hello, it's Akbar and Adam coming at you, episode 15 in our journey through the philosophy of climate change. Today, we're going to be looking at the third in our little three-part mini-series on theories of climate politics. And this one I'm calling climate politics as propaganda. The image I have up here is Napoleon as depicted by his sort of right-hand man, his artist in residence. And this is often pointed to as an instance of propaganda because actually, on this particular journey across the mountains, Napoleon rode on a donkey. But this looks a lot better, right? So this gives you some sense of what we're going to talk about is distorting reality, perhaps even flat out lying. It seems like we got to talk about that sort of thing when we're talking about climate change, right? So let's get into it. All right, here's what I want to do. Like we've done in the other two, I just want to describe and evaluate this propaganda theory and put it in comparison with the other two that we've looked at. We'll start with the failure of the applied science model, remind ourselves of the paradox theory that we looked at, and then look at this propaganda theory. Define propaganda and talk about some of the nuances a little bit. And then we have to talk a bit about Merchants of Doubt, a book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, which is really the seminal text for people who see climate politics through this lens, right? Through or with this tool, this theory. And it is very influential, I would say. Many of your leading environmentalists, even climate scientists, I think will have kind of this theory, at least even if it's not fully articulated, they'll kind of have this understanding of climate politics. So I think it's really good to think it through. And then I had you read this piece of The Collapse of Western Civilization, and I just think it's also fantastic by the same authors. And I just want to pull out some takeaways from that. So that's what I want to do today. Start with Akbar. New feature here. Akbar has a nice coffee and reads about the end of the world. I'm sorry, I'm stuck it's a pandemic. I'm stuck here in this room with this guy. So our sense of humor is getting worse and worse. In the news today, something we don't often think about is what are the financial sector implications of climate change? And a new report came out under the Trump administration, interestingly, that talks about financial havoc that may come about because of climate change. And I won't go into it in detail. I have this linked in the notes if you want to follow up. It's fascinating. What, for example, in the wake of what would happen in the wake of California wildfires if the insurance industry just decided to pull up shop and say, we're not going to insure any more buildings, no more homes in certain areas? I mean, think about the economic and financial fallout from that kind of thing. So that's what that report is all about. A little bit of tooting my own horn here. This is one of my articles I've published that nobody's ever read, but it's out there. I linked to it in the notes. I can get you a copy, please. For the love of God, don't purchase it. I can get you a copy if you write to me. A lot of this talk is going to be pulling from this paper, so I just wanted to not be accused of self-plagiarism by explicitly citing myself here. I can hopefully get past that criticism. So let's remind ourselves where we are. First, we had this applied science model. We talked a lot about climate science, and we said, well, maybe politics is basically just applied science. You just do the science, you get the knowledge, everybody can see the same facts, so they come to consensus, and they all see what the decision should be. And then we noted, well, wait a second, there's persistent controversy, gridlock, disagreement in the wake of growing scientific studies. So it seems like this model breaks down. Why? Okay. Last time we talked about, well, it's this paradox that gets us trapped in this iron triangle, which is the gridlock and disagreement and controversy. So the politicians fund science, and then the key here is that science produces this excess of objectivity. That is like the duck-rabbit thing. There's two or more legitimate ways of seeing what's going on. Advocates, special interest groups pick up on that, cherry pick the view that serves their interests, tell the politicians what to do, and the politicians continue to see double from Thomas Hobbes, and then they continue to say, well, science will clear this up eventually, right? And around we go. Note how many times Sarowitz talked about, Sarowitz being a key proponent of this model, talked about legitimate differences here, excess of objectivity. Not that there's junk science, good science, bad science. It's all good science. It's just different sciences, the plurality of science in the natural world, right? Well, maybe there's an alternative explanation. And look, I'm going to put this out there. You asked me what I think about it. I think both of these models, the paradox and the propaganda one, have a lot of validity. Both of them apply to our world. I think can explain situations well. I I would say you got to use both to understand politics of climate change. Maybe that's kind of weaseling my way out of it, but I'm not trying to say these are mutually exclusive necessarily, or that you got to pick one or the other. So, problem though, right? We said one of the problems with the paradox model is maybe false equivalency. And maybe a different way of saying that problem is there's the elephant in the room is what Oreskes and Conway and others will call the carbon industrial complex: big oil, big gas, big coal, the Koch brothers, right? Other well-funded corporations, and then think tanks like the Heartland Institute, media outlets, right? What about all of this? Isn't this the heart of climate politics? Where has that been this whole time, right? And this theory of propaganda centers on these powerful actors with their special interests to perpetuate our petroculture, right? Our carbon intensive way of life, right? They want that to continue. That's how they make money. So that's got to be a driver of your theory of climate politics. What do? Well, they fund junk science. Okay, they get fringe scientists who are willing to take their money, and they do their own studies. And instead of knowledge, you get doubt and confusion now, because all this stuff is in the mix. They fund an alternative media universe to frame and spin and pitch now this confusing landscape of scientific knowledge. They take advantage of the media's doctrine of neutrality, meaning that they need to, if A says something, they better find what B says about it, right? That's being a good reporter. So they always get to say, hey, what about us? We have a point of view. And the conclusion then would be, well, there's a debate. You know, they say the climate is changing, but this other group says it's not changing. So I don't know. We don't know. So instead of political consensus, you get disagreement, right? Confusion, doubt, disagreement. And what else do they do? Of course, campaign contributions. Buy your politicians, lobbyists. You know, and then instead of wise policy action, you get a perpetuation of the status quo, which is precisely what they want, right? So this is a story of climate politics with nefarious actors using their power, using their money to influence science and politics in ways to their advantage. And on the surface of it, come on, it's got to be true to some extent, right? Where am I getting this from? These are, I think, important books. These are all linked in your notes. In particular, Merchants of Doubt, and we'll talk about that one. So I gave you a little one slide schematic of it, and you could probably say, hey, Adam, where's the empirical evidence for this? In this little lecture, all I can say is read these books, okay? Because these books are well footnoted, and they talk about specific actors: Fred Singer, Hill and Knowlton, right, the PR firm. You get into the documents and the details. You follow the money. You follow the influence. It's all there. Okay, so this is a well-documented, empirically grounded theory of climate politics. That's my point. Okay. Define propaganda real quick. I put this one up. Any association, systematic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation. Akbar, help me out here. Oh, see, I have to move my little face out of the way. Okay. Of a particular doctrine or practice carried out by an interested party, like the carbon industrial complex, in a tendentious or biased way, in order to encourage or instill a particular attitude or response. Now look, this is tricky stuff. propaganda does have a negative connotation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so we'd have to be careful, like, when is it good, when is it bad? What makes it good, what makes it bad? I mean, persuasion's okay, right? We've been talking about, you have to frame things one way or another. That's unavoidable, right? When you have public health propaganda, that's good, right? Like, wear a mask during the pandemic, wash your hands. What about advertising, right? All the gray zone that we get into there. And the other thing I just wanted to say is I used Napoleon, and we got to poke fun at him a little bit, riding on his donkey. But let's not pretend, those of you who are Americans out there, or really whatever nationality, that somehow you're exempted or special, or propaganda hasn't worked in your nation or your culture. For us Americans, if you want, just go ahead and Google World War II propaganda, anti-Japanese propaganda. You might get the idea what I'm talking about. So I think we're all susceptible to this. And the other thing to note is, look, the attitude that they may want you to have, or the belief, or the response, is not a particular belief, or even fear or hatred, although that's often what people want with propaganda. It can be doubt, confusion, skepticism, chaos, but in particular for us, doubt. Right? Not that you want to, they don't have to get you to believe that climate change is a hoax. They just have to get you to think, maybe it's not settled. Maybe we don't know. Maybe I don't know, right? That's all they have to do. Okay. I put a link to this in your notes as well. There's a lot of theories of propaganda. This has been studied a lot. And I won't claim to be an expert in it, but this is one I think is really useful. This 4D model, what's going on with propaganda? Dismiss, that is to deny, to cover things up. You can look at the story of ExxonMobil and other oil and gas companies and what they knew about climate change and how long they knew it and how long they just covered it up. Distort, like I said, fund alternative research. Flood the media with distorting, confusing messages. The NIPCC, look this up. This is a group that tries to look a lot like the IPCC to confuse the message. Distract, or what we call whataboutism, shifting the blame. Oh, no, carbon is a problem for personal responsibility, so look at your individual carbon footprint. Or look how green we are. So there's these greenwashing campaigns, right, for oil and gas companies that are still basically in the business of extracting carbon out of the ground. And then the fourth D, dismay. Talk about how awful life will be, how crushing it will be if we were to shift away from fossil fuels. So I think you see all of this in this propaganda model. Briefly, on the merchants of doubt, simple. Climate change is a problem rooted in this free market ideology. It's a huge market failure. We didn't price carbon. It's this externality, and it shows that we need government regulation. But major corporations don't want it. Don't want this. As the song says, I ain't trying to hear that, right? So they fight it with the tobacco strategy or this propaganda strategy. That's what we've been talking about. Okay, the tobacco industry was really the first to pioneer some of these things we've been talking about in terms of warding off government regulations by sowing confusion and doubt. For example, hiring the same PR firms as the tobacco lobbyists. And I just mentioned this here. Check this out. It's in your notes. Short documentary by Josh Fox about the fracking industry. Naomi Oreskes makes an appearance in this documentary because they talk about the same propaganda strategy being brought to bear, in this case around fracking and drinking water contamination. So if you're looking for teaching materials or just more materials, this is a good one. And it's a good illustration of the theory we're talking about. But I had you read this one. This is a book, actually. So there's an article length version that I assigned to this class. And then there's a book length version too, if you're really interested in it. And same authors, Oreskes and Conway. Last thing I want to do then in this lecture is just pull out 9 points quickly, because you can read it on your own. And then we'll wrap up. This is like, I like this one even maybe better than Merchants of Doubt, because Merchants of Doubt establishes this sort of empirical basis for this theory. Here they kind of run this theory through a narrative, a science fiction narrative about the future. So I think it's more engaging. And they're asking simply, from the future now, looking way back at our time in the 21st century, how could it be that we saw it coming, climate change catastrophe, but we failed to act? Now, there's lots of answers they give, but really the core of it is this propaganda theory. So some of the other answers they give, I mean, it's all tied together, but psychologically, look, we're just kind of wired to have this adaptive optimism. It's a little bit like the frog in the boiling pot. You know, we just get used to things. And we think, oh, this is fine. I can get along with this. You know, it'll get better. And before you know it, the water's boiling, right? Some of them, things they talk about are empirical, particular things like this idea that we thought all this fracking we're doing for shale gas, natural gas will serve as a bridge fuel to renewables. And they make a case that no, that's not what happens or will happen in the future. They have this geoengineering example. Check that out. I think that's fascinating. We know a little bit about that now as one of the strategies. They think, you know, they paint a pretty grim version of that. Positive feedback, that was one of our climate terms. CH4, methane, causing a positive feedback loop. So those are more particular things. I want to highlight three other things. Science, they say. Science is set up to have a problem here because in its historical feud with religion, science decided that it was going to avoid type 1 errors at all costs. So those would be the sinful errors. That is to say, to believe that something exists when in fact it does not exist. Okay. The industry, the carbon industrial complex, has weaponized this feature of science by saying, yeah, hold on, we don't want to believe climate change is really happening unless we're really, really sure, right? That's only good science, right? You know, this I think is a very important insight that they make because I do think that's happening. And the problem is that we don't really have the time, right? If we're going to listen to the IPCC reports to be absolutely certain. So science in a way is tripped up on its own axiology, its own value system, and the industry knows it and is using it against it. Positivism, or the linear model, I think it's basically the same thing, has failed. And why, they say? Well, scientists aren't in charge, okay? That would help, they think. I'm not so sure. I worry about technocracy, maybe. Iron law just simply meaning economic growth trumps everything else. We'll talk, I think, a bit about that later in the semester. And then, of course, the dynamics of the merchants of doubt kicks in, right? So why did we see it coming and fail to act? All of these reasons. And on top of all of this is this propaganda going on. The rich and powerful benefit from the perpetuation of the status quo, and they kept us from seeing and acting on the reality right before our eyes because they confused us, right? And then beneath or encompassing even that is this market fundamentalism, this belief that not only is the market an efficient way to increase productivity and to have individual freedom, but it's like the only way, right? So this ideology, they say, got out of control and it became this propaganda or this Trojan horse that makes it sound good, like, hey, free markets, individual liberty, yeah. But really it was just a Trojan horse for the interests of the greedy and the powerful. It really just became socialism for the super rich, right? As they gobbled up all of the resources of society for their own uses. And at the end, China fares best in their story because egad, you know, they're a socialist country who actually has some central planning and some cooperation going on. So take it or leave it, you know, it is a fictional story, but it weaves actual history into the beginning of it, and it has this theoretical component. So I think it's really a fun read. Okay, Akbar and I were reading that article, and he said something really insightful. He said, you know, maybe the root problem is a Western metaphysics of individualism. And I said, whoa, Akbar, you're onto something there, maybe. Okay. Well, we can talk about that later. That's one to chew on. Until next time, may the force be with you.